May 13th, 1951, three-term congressman walks in for a dinner party and meets a freelance photographer, and that's where JFK, Bobby's uncle, met Bobby's aunt, which is Jackie, and that happened here. And Georgetown is famously haunted with wonderfully haunted with great memories and stuff, and I know for a fact that your aunt and uncle will be so proud of you being here tonight. So let's hear it for it. It's fantastic. Wonderful. Wonderful. And Tony Lyons is here, my buddy from Michigan. We were dorm mates in Alsloyd at Michigan, is the guy who introduced me to Bobby Kennedy years ago at a book signing party at his place in New York City. And then I immediately got on board when Bobby decided to run for president for a number of things. We were at your announcement at the Park Plaza, where ironically I was there last night. Priscilla was with me. And you said a couple things that really resonated with me. And you invoked your uncle, you invoked your dad, specifically with your dad. I'm paraphrasing, but you said that he would take you on vacations to places like the Dakotas, and you would vacation with Native Americans, and your dad would say, "These are Kennedy people, they need your help." And that really stuck with me. I thought that was fantastic. And so there was that, and then you have a wonderful way about you with that kind of stuff, and I just think you're gonna make a fantastic president. So thrilled to have you here. Before you talk, I'm gonna introduce my buddy Tony, and then we're gonna hear from you. So fantastic, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming here. Let's hear for Tony Lyons.
Yeah.
Who is the CEO of Skyhorse Publishing. And take it away, buddy.
Hi, yeah, I'm Tony Lyons. I'm the co-founder of the Super PAC American Values 2024, and we're throwing this party tonight. Thank you all for coming. I've known Bobby Kennedy for more than 10 years. I'm his publisher and his friend, and I have just great respect for him. And I really think that we haven't had a president who's had the kind of authenticity and integrity and character that Bobby Kennedy has in decades. And it's time that we have that once again. So I'd like to say a poem that I know Bobby likes. It's called The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats, in honor of Bobby's 70th birthday. So the poem is, "Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming, hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of the spiritus mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man is moving its slow thighs, whilst all around us move real shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast his hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born." So I was thinking about that poem, and I was thinking, the best lack all conviction, the worst are full of passionate intensity. And I think, Bobby doesn't lack conviction. Bobby has great conviction and, great steadiness and sincerity. And he has real passionate intention and intensity. And there's, no other reason why he wants to be president other than to make this country a better place, to make this country the kind of country that we all here want it to be, and that we know that it can be. So I'm really happy to introduce Bobby Kennedy to you, and thank you again for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Tony. Thank you all for being here tonight. I apologize for coming in and then disappearing. I had TV show scheduled on with Chris Cuomo outside in a van, and they had promised us D Block, which would have been workable. But then they had a breaking news story, so I was out there sweating, knowing you guys were all. And I actually walked out while Stuart was doing his first introduction of me, so it was not a relaxing experience out there. But I really apologize to all of you for keeping you waiting, and I thank you for your forbearance. And I thank Stuart so much and Priscilla for making this evening so wonderful. And Tony, who's my friend, who's been my publisher for about a decade, has published about 10 of my books, and but more importantly, he's published books that nobody else published. He published 1,000 books a year, and he publishes books that nobody else will touch. And there are a lot of stuff I don't agree with, but it's stuff that needs to be said, and stuff a lot that I do. But it's stuff that has to be said. We're in a democracy, and we need to be able to talk about ideas, and we need to be able to talk about things that are outlandish.
Right.
And as I've said many times before, the First Amendment was written not to protect easy speech, not to protect the kind of speech that we all want to hear, that we're all comfortable with. It was to protect the unpleasant speech, the speech that none of us wants to hear, the speech that everybody wants to silence, the annoying voices, the dissenting voices. And Tony's been one of the most forthright and relentless crusaders for free speech on the American landscape.
Thank you. Hey, Tony! Tony!
And I want to thank again Stuart for bringing me back to this house. I was at this house many times as a kid. Charlie Bartlett, who was one of my uncle's best friends, was the owner of this house at that time, and he was a publisher. And my Aunt Jackie did a column for him called The Inquiring Photographer, where she would take a picture of somebody and then do a short interview with them. And the first time she met my uncle was in one of those interviews. And she asked him a question during that interview. She asked him what he thought his most important quality was. And he surprised her with his answer. She assumed that he would say courage, because he had written a Pulitzer Prize winning book on courage, Profiles in Courage. He was the only president who's won the Purple Heart. He was a hero during the war. He rescued his crew, and he had demonstrated his own heroic qualities already by that time. But the answer he gave her was curiosity. And that's a quality that I think all of us need to cultivate. And that when I see it in people, I associate it with open minds. I associate it with compassion. I associate it with empathy, with the capacity to put yourself in other people's shoes. And I think that was my uncle's best quality. I think that was the quality that allowed him, during the 1,000 days that he was in office, to keep this country out of war. He told, in a mansion very close to here, he told Katharine Graham's mansion, he told one of his best friends, Ben Bradley, who was then the publisher of the Washington, or the editor-in-chief of the Washington Post, and Graham was the publisher. Bradley asked him what he wanted on his epithet on his gravestone. This is when he was already president, and he said he kept the peace. He said the primary job of a president of the United States is to keep the country out of war. And he said that he didn't want children in Africa and Asia, when they heard about the United States of America, to think of a man with a gun. He wanted them to think of a Peace Corps volunteer. He wanted them to think of the Alliance for Progress. He wanted them to think of USAID, which he created those two agencies in order to lift and run the oligarchs and all the foreign, U.S. foreign policy up to that point had been to funnel money to the oligarchs who said, and to the dictators who said we hate communists, and to the militaries who supported them. And meanwhile, they were starving and oppressing their own poor. And my uncle said that is a formula for revolution, and you're creating communists by doing that. And he said America needs to be on the side of the poor. Actually, he had his two favorite trips as president. One was to Ireland, in which he famous when he left Shannon Airport, the entire Irish people showed up to see the first Irish Catholic president, a real source of pride to their nation. And he famously told them as he left the Shannon Airport that I'll be back in the springtime. And that's a promise that he could never keep. But his other favorite trip during his presidency was to Colombia, where he met the leader Yedis Camargo, who was one of the greatest Latin American leaders. And there's a square that's now called John F. Kennedy Square. There's a whole neighborhood in Bogota named after my uncle. And 2 million people showed up to see him in the square. And Yedis Camargo said to my uncle, and my uncle, Jackie later said after Jack was killed, he said that he was more impressed with Yedis Camargo than any leader, any statesman. They had met de Gaulle, they had met Eamon de Valera, the George Washington of Ireland. They had met all these extraordinary leaders, Sukarno, etc., the liberator of Indonesia. But they said of all the leaders they met, Yedis Camargo was the most gifted. And Yedis Camargo said to my uncle, "Do you know why they love you?" And my uncle said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you put America on the side of the poor. They think that." And, my uncle kept the country out of war. He didn't send a single combat troop abroad during his presidency. He realized 4 months into his presidency during the Bay of Pigs invasion that the CIA, the intelligence apparatus, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that they felt that their job was to provide a continuous pipeline of wars with a military-industrial complex. And I was at his inauguration as a 6-year-old kid, but I remember it like it was yesterday. And 3 days before, on my birthday, January 17, 1961, Eisenhower, the outgoing president, gave his farewell address in which he warned Americans against the rise of a military-industrial complex that would destroy American democracy, that would turn us into an imperium abroad and a surveillance state at home. And my uncle was determined not to let that happen. 4 months in, when he was lied to by the CIA about the Bay of Pigs, at the height, he took public, when the men were dying, 2,200 men on the beach, some of them dying, the rest being captured. He took public blame for it, but privately he said to his aides, "I want to take the CIA and shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds." And for the next 3 years, he was battling against that apparatus to keep the country out of war. They wanted to go in 61 into Cuba, 62 into Berlin, 62 into Cuba again, 61 into Laos, which he refused. They called him a traitor. He refused to send combat troops to Vietnam. They wanted 250,000. He sent 16,000 advisors, ultimately under great pressure, Green Berets. And by the way, he sent more than that. He sent about 20,000 troops to get one black man, James Meredith, into Ole Miss in Oxford, Mississippi. It was a small number of troops. And in November of 1963, or October 23rd, 1963, he heard that a Green Beret had died. And he called Walt Rostow, who was one of his aides, and he said, I want a casualty list. And Rostow brought him that list, and there was 75 Americans had died. And he said, that's too many. I'm bringing them all home. And that afternoon, he signed National Security Order 263, ordering all combat troops, all military personnel home from Vietnam by 65, with the first 1,000 coming home in December of 63, so a month later. 4 weeks to the day after he signed that order, he was murdered. And a week after that, President Johnson remanded that order and then sent 250,000 troops there. And, my father ran against the war in 68, was killed. Nixon became president, sent 500,000 troops there. 56,000 never came home, including my cousin George Skakel, who was killed in the Tet Offensive. And but one of the ways that my uncle kept us out of war was because he said, always put yourself in the shoes of your opponent. And he was able, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, to put himself into the shoes of Khrushchev and understand. And he put in a hotline to Khrushchev for the first time. The CIA had no idea what was happening in the Kremlin because there was a mole at Langley, and all the spies, as soon as they turned, were killed. So they didn't know who, they saw it as a monolith. And my uncle said, it couldn't be that. It's got to be just like Boston, where everybody's fighting each other on the local level. That's how politics works. And he found out that was true. And then he started this extraordinary correspondence with Khrushchev, where they sent 26 letters to each other. And secretly, my father had a friend, my father and mother, called Georgy Bolshoi, who was a KGB spy. And he used to come to our house at Hickory Hill all the time. The State Department was horrified because everybody knew he was a spy. But we loved him as kids because he would do the Cossack dancing, and he had all these kind of tricks, and he would do rope climbing contests with my dad and push-up contests. And the first of the letters that Khrushchev knew, my father trusted him. And the first of the letters, he didn't want to go through his own apparatus, so he gave it to Bolshoi. And Bolshoi came and gave it to my dad. And then they smuggled 26 private letters back and forth to each other, these extraordinary personal letters talking about their lives, their children. And they installed a hotline. So there was a red phone at the White House and also in our house at the Cape. And we all knew not to touch it because if you lifted it up, Khrushchev was getting it. But it was that curiosity that he had that allowed him to understand it couldn't be a monolith. They couldn't all be evil people like these cartoon depictions that we always get about our enemies. It has to be more complicated than that. And they realized, Khrushchev and my uncle were both war heroes. They had both fought, and they both understood how bad war was. Khrushchev had been at Stalingrad, and which was the worst battle of World War II. And neither of them wanted to get us into another war. And, because of my uncle's forbearance, and because of his decision to project economic power abroad rather than military power, there are today more statues to John Kennedy, more boulevards named after him, more avenues, more streets, more neighborhoods, more universities in Latin America and Africa and Asia than any other president, US president, and probably more than all the other presidents combined. And I run into people from Africa all the time. I ran into one last night whose name is Kennedy, because the love and affection people had for our country all over the world. And that was a huge asset for us. We've spent $8 trillion on wars over the past 20 years and bombing things, and made ourselves less safe home and abroad, less popular, fewer friends. BRICS is a direct result of that. And we're bankrupt now. Our kids are $34 trillion in debt to pay for this. During that same period, the Chinese have spent $8 trillion while we've been bombing bridges, ports, hospitals, schools. The Chinese have been building them. And they've, with their Belt and Road program, they're now the biggest creditor in Latin America and in almost every country in Africa. That's where we were 10 years ago. And we don't even have relationships with these countries anymore. And President Trump's not going to bring this back. President Biden is not going to. You know, President Trump, I believe, wants to, drain the swamp. I think he was sincere when he said that. But he appointed John Bolton to run the NSA. He's a swamp creature, like the template for swamp creatures. And, Scott Gottlieb, who was Pfizer's business partner to run FDA, and Pfizer, and Gottlieb did Operation Warp Speed, an $88 billion gift to Pfizer, and then went back to collect his paycheck on the Pfizer board. So President Biden is not going to unravel it. President Trump is not going to do it. And, I think I'm the only candidate that knows how to do this, that understands how badly we need to do this in this country if we're going to return the middle class and if we're going to give our kids a chance. So I want to thank again Stuart for hosting this event and, for all of you. And I feel such positive energy, good energy and love from so many of you. And I hope to meet all of you and to get my picture taken with everybody here. And I really apologize to you all for being late and keeping you waiting.
Thank you.
Let's go!
Lee, you have a few words you want to say?